And now we're going to be starting the presentation. Computer hardware. This is the computer hardware lesson brought to you by the Computer Engineering Club. First, look at the table of contents.
First off, we're going to talk about the CPU, or as many of you may already know, this is also called the central processing unit. It can also be referred to as the brain of the computer. For some of you who don't know what a CPU is, that's like an easy way of understanding what it is. So after that, we'll be talking about motherboards, and motherboards are basically the framework of a computer. So they're kind of similar to a human skeleton or circuitry system, as every single component is connected to the motherboard. RAM. So RAM, I'm assuming many of you probably already heard of this term or probably already know the definition or meaning of it, but we're still going to go in depth a little bit about it. So RAM, random access memory, is used as a temporary storage because it is volatile and it loses data once it loses power. After that, we'll talk a little bit about video or graphics cards, and it's used to process graphic-related data, which CPUs struggle at processing. So we'll go a little bit in depth on the companies that create it, as well as what graphics cards are. Okay, sound cards. So mainly professionals and enthusiasts who do video editing or video related or audio related kind of things use sound cards. As regular consumers, gamers, and etc. just use the built-in sound cards on the motherboards, as those are sufficient enough for our needs. So next we'll talk a little bit about expansion slots. These slots are used to upgrade a system as it becomes outdated, or we can use it to add features to PC. It's also used to increase the storage capacities of PCs. So after that, we'll talk a little bit about hard drives. So hard drives are non-volatile storage devices used to store data on a long term. This is because even if they lose power, they still retain the data which has been written to them. After that, we'll talk a little bit about optical drives. They're used to read optical diskettes such as CDs, DVDs, and so on. So these are the 4 ports we'll be talking about. The first 3, the parallel port, RS-232, and firewire ports, we won't be talking too much about or going in any depth into these because these are really old ports, which not too many PCs use at all nowadays. And USB is probably the most popular port. It's from mobile to the desktops, everything uses USBs, even TVs have them nowadays. So that's a port we'll be talking very in depth about, and the different generations, revisions, and so on. VGA, TVI, HDMI. These 3 are different kinds of ports which display graphics or video. So VGA and HDMI are probably the most popular, as VGA is cheaper and used in large enterprise scenarios or settings, and consumers also use VGA, but HDMI is more prominently used in residential consumer areas, as it allows for extremely high resolution outputs, and many gamers and etc. use them. BIOS, the basic input-output system. So this connects the major component hardware components that are in your computer together. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the operating system. The operating system starts after the BIOS, gives it control, and it basically controls the computer afterwards.
Now I'm going to be talking about the central processing unit. The central processing unit, also known as a CPU, is the brain of a computer, and it's where most of the processes take place. The central processing unit has 2 main components, or units, within it. The ALU, also known as the arithmetic logic unit, and the control unit. The arithmetic logic unit does both calculations that are arithmetic and logical that are given to the CPU, while the control unit sends instructions to hardware, along with things like fetching, decoding, and executing data. CPU is also composed of cache, registers, and an MMU, also known as memory management unit, which we will talk about later. Cache is dedicated CPU temporary storage. It's where temporary files that the CPU needs are stored. An interesting thing that CPUs are able to do is hyperthreading. Hyperthreading is the ability for a single core to perform 2 processes simultaneously, and is generally used for better performance from a CPU. A CPU also has many densely packed transistors in it. Because of this, they produce a lot of heat, so they require heat sinks and fans to keep them cool. If you've ever opened up a computer, you've probably noticed that the CPU has a heatsink, a fan, or both. Next, system clock. The system clock is something within the CPU that keeps the hardware components in sync. It's a tiny quartz crystal which vibrates and produces pulses that happen at set intervals. The crystal is known as an oscillator. These crystals can also be found in common items like watches and clocks.
Okay, so now I'll be actually showing you guys an actual processor. I've actually opened up the lid for the processor, so hopefully you guys can see my camera. And so this is actually an AMD processor. It's a really old one, and as you guys can see, I've opened it up over here. It's supposed to go like this, but I've removed this so you guys can see the internals of it. So the arithmetic logic unit, the MMU, control unit, registers, cache, the system clock, everything's inside here. The middle part's the CPU itself. The side is the units I was referring to, Ishan had referred to. And Ishan also mentioned the heatsink which goes on top of the CPU, as well as the CPU fan. So here's also one that goes along with the CPU I just opened up and showed you guys. Okay, so now we're just gonna continue on.
Next, the arithmetic logic unit, which we talked about earlier. The arithmetic logic unit, or ALU, does calculations both arithmetic and logical, as in the name, which are given to the CPU. It uses register to store calculated values when it needs to do a complex calculation, which requires those calculated values. And as soon as the calculation is finished, the register will be empty for future values. The ALU also gets data that is needed from input registers, and the instructions on what calculations it needs to perform through the instructions register. The ALU then passes the calculated values or result of comparison to the accumulator, which will save it to the cache. Next, the control unit. The control unit, we also spoke about earlier, controls other hardware components of a PC. It fetches, decodes, and executes instructions that are given to it. The control unit also is used to move data around the computer between the components. It controls the transfer. It controls the transfer data between different hardware components, and it also manages when data is transferred between the hardware with help from the CPU clock. Next is the memory management unit. The memory management unit, also known as the MMU, is used to manage the data flow between the CPU and the RAM, which we will explain later. The MMU also provides protection for the RAM, or memory as it's sometimes called, which is required when multitasking and when conversions between virtual and physical memory addresses occur. Sometimes MMUs are not integrated into the CPU, but rather on the motherboard as a separate IC, or integrated circuit.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit about the motherboard. So the 5 main concepts we're going to talk about is the system bus clock, form factors, chipset, and VRM, as well as the BIOS. So we're going to start off with a bit about the system bus, which is compiled up of the address bus, control bus, and data bus. Then the bus clock, which helps synchronize and manage the communication between components. And then we're going to talk about 4 main form factors of motherboards. In the picture you guys can only see 3, but in the side we're going to be talking about, you will see all 4. The one missing here is E80X. Next, after that, we'll talk a little bit about the chipset and VRM. So chipsets help the CPU communicate with other components. And we'll finally talk about the BIOS, which starts up and checks if all major system components are working through post. So in this picture for the BIOS, you guys can probably see that's a chip which you guys can remove and put in. This is a chip that belongs to really old BIOSes, as newer motherboards actually come with soldered on flashed chips, which can be reflashed rather than these chips which you have to replace every single time you want to change the BIOS or anything. And in between there are the modern ones and these ones, they're actually chips that were also soldered, but you couldn't flash them like modern day ones. The system bus. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the data bus. So what the data bus does is it transfers data throughout the computer. So any sort of data that's been transferred from one component to another would be done through the data bus. The control bus would send instructions throughout the computer from like which area, from what, like the paths for the data bus and etc. The control bus would create and send. The address bus, on the other hand, would be the ones that would let the control bus know the final location and initial location of the data. After that, power bus. So the power bus actually supplies power throughout the computer to all the components on the motherboard or connected to the motherboard. So as I stated before, we would talk about 4 form factors. So this is the one that was missing, I told you guys before, the eATX. We'll also be talking about ATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX. So these 4 are more commonly referred to. That's why we're going to talk about these 4 mainly, but there are actually multiple other form factors which are not really used nowadays. So first one, eATX, which stands for Extended Advanced Technology Extended. Weird name, but it's the largest of the 4, and this form factor allows for more expansion slots, and mainly enthusiasts use this as it allows for SLI, Crossfire, and which, if you guys don't know, that's like 2 to 4 graphics cards and put in line together to double or triple the performance of your graphics. The next would be the ATX, which is a little more budget friendly, and many consumers use ATX, gamers and so on. So it's like a standard is basically ATX form, and it comes with around usually 6 expansion slots. Next up is a micro ATX. So this micro advanced technology extended motherboard is generally bought by people who are on budget, as these motherboards are cheaper, smaller, and allow for more portability. And generally these motherboards come with around 3 to 4 expansion slots. So the more commonly found ones are ATX and micro ATX, in case any of you are wondering. They're the motherboards that are more commonly used, these form factors. Mini ITX, or Mini Information Technology Extended, is actually used for more media related purposes like streaming and stuff like that. And because Mini ITX is one of the most compact forms and the smallest of the four form factors we're talking about, it actually comes with only 1 or 2 expansion slots. So general motherboard information. So the chipset. I'm going to talk a little bit about the chipset, but before that, I want to let you guys know that in the past, the chipset was actually known as the North and South Bridge, and they were 2 individual chips. So in the case of now modern day motherboards, they've put them both together into one thing which they call a chipset. So I'm just going to talk about them individually, but in the case of modern day motherboards, they're basically both put together. So North and South Bridge are connected to one another. And the North Bridge is connected to the CPU, RAM, PCI, and the PCI Express ports, while the South Bridge is connected to the input-output slots and ports, as well as storage devices and the BIOS. The North Bridge usually handles faster components, while the South Bridge handles slower components. Next, the system clock. So the system clock is used to sync data transfer. So the system clock, which is different from the CPU clock, helps data transfer without collisions. It helps sync the timing of the data transfers. So what I mean by that is that the system clocks actually help with making sure that the timings from when one data is going to another, so that 2 datas are not going the opposite directions on the same path, resulting in them colliding with one another. So next is the VRM, or voltage regulator module. VRMs are found on all motherboards, and what they do is make sure that the amount of power which is being given to the CPU is within the CPU's voltage capacity. In modern motherboards, they are also used to over and underclock CPUs. These VRMs are also capable of protecting your CPU from power surges. After that, the BIOS, so the basic input-output system. In case you guys don't already know, the BIOS starts up before anything else from the EEPROM of a motherboard. Nowadays, as I stated before, they start from a flash memory. The BIOS performs post-power on self-test, which checks to see if all the major components of the computer are working with no issues. BIOS information is stored in the RAM or read-only memory, which is non-volatile storage, so it does not get erased when it has no power. So this is something that BIOS used to be, was a mediator between the hardware and software, but now drivers for such peripherals or expansion cards, speakers, and stuff like that allow the software to communicate directly with the hardware, so which means that the use of that through the BIOS is no longer needed.
That's all for now. Thank you very much for watching.